Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online right now at wessexpress.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 193, Doings of Doyle.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became astronomer.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Well, hello and welcome once again to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And you're here for the doings of the dynamic podcasting duo. What do you say?
No, we're here for the Doings of Doyle. We just get in the way.
I know. Well, we're looking very much forward to speaking with our guest today, who is the host or co-host, I should say, of another podcast. There are a number of Sherlockian and Doylean podcasts out there, and we are happy to share the stage with them and give them more of the limelight, because we think the more, the better. You know, everyone brings a different approach to this. Everyone has different expertise, and we are happy to have colleagues like of the sort that you'll hear today on the show in just a moment. First, a little housekeeping. I'd like to remind you that this is I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 193. That means you can find it at ihose.co/ihose193. That'll bring you directly to the ihearofsherlock.com website. And you can leave us a comment right there on that episode. Of course, you can always email us if that's more your thing at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. And if you'd like to attach a voicemail to that, just speak into your phone, into the voice message function, and attach that to an email and send it along, and we'll play it on the air, if your dulcet tones can match that of Bert's and mine. Of course, you can always stay in touch with us on social media, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. We are I Hear of Sherlock in all of those places, and we do appreciate your support via Patreon and PayPal. Check out those buttons on our website. Your contribution helps us to run the show and to do things like transcripts. And we're getting ever so close to that minimum we need to make those transcripts possible. We really want to be able to afford that for our hearing impaired listeners. So help us make that possible. As simple as $1 an episode, you can help to contribute to making I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere great again. We are pleased to be joined by Mark Jones, who has been fascinated by the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle since he read the canon one wet summer holiday as a 12-year-old. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Before he dove into the Lost World, he studied and taught the history of the 18th and 19th centuries and continues to work in higher education as a consultant. Mark has written several books on television, film, and literature, including Dark Matters, which he co-wrote with Lance Parkin, an introduction to Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials novels for young teenagers, and Mark has contributed to articles in the Baker Street Journal, Canadian Holmes, the Serpentine Muse, and numerous blogs. Both Mark and Paul Chapman are members of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London and the Scandalous Bohemians, which is a Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle society based in the north of England. And they hold regular meetings in Leeds and York. In 2018, together with Paul's partner Teresa Dudley, who is secretary of the Scandalous Bohemians, they organized Through a Glass Darkly M.R. James Conference in New York. Mark, welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Delight to be here, and thanks very much for having me.
Absolutely. Now, I sensed a very dark theme in your bio as I read it there. You want to tell us a little bit about that dark influence that we hear running throughout?
I suppose I'm a bit of a goth at heart, and have always been drawn to the gothic side of Conan Doyle's work, and wider works as well. And with my co-host on the podcast, Paul Chapman, we have delved into writers like M.R. James at length as well. And as you said in the bio, one of the first things that we did together was to organize a conference on M.R. James in York to explore his writings as well. But our first passion has always been Sherlock Holmes and indeed Conan Doyle.
Well, before we get to the Sherlock Holmes portion, I mean, obviously that's why everyone is here. Talk to us a little bit about M.R. James. I'm curious because I'm not an M.R. James scholar. I wouldn't say I know the first thing about M.R. James. So could you help educate some of our listeners?
Well, M.R. James was a great academic working at the end of the 19th century who was a real pioneer of the ghost story and a significant influence on the evolution of the ghost stories. And so he wrote some very famous works, Casting the Runes, O Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, and things like that, which have been adapted over the years. And in Britain, they're particularly known for being adapted for television in the 70s for a series of ghost stories for Christmas that would appear on Christmas Eve. So just as you'd be settling down and hoping that Father Christmas would be delivering something that evening, you might also be scaring yourself to death by watching a ghost story from the pen of M.R. James. And he's had a bit of a resurgence in recent years. There's a big overlap with Sherlockian interest there as well, because people like Mark Gatiss is a big fan of M.R. James and has done a couple of the most recent adaptations for BBC.
Interesting. So is M.R. James sort of a British Lovecraft? Are there those similarities?
He's very much about sort of a creeping horror. He doesn't go in for blood and guts and the sort of full-throated horrors, but he goes in for that tingling sensation down the spine. Or the one I particularly like is he's clearly an arachnophobe, so almost all of his stories have something to do with something small and furry with several legs appearing out of somewhere. So he's an interesting character. And actually, again, there's another Sherlockian connection there. He's the subject of a new biography that's coming out soon by Darrell Jones, who edited the Oxford Classics edition of Conan Doyle's Gothic Tales. So there's a small coterie of people who are interested in, I think, the same things and have often delved into Conan Doyle from the point of view of his Gothic literature as much as from his Sherlock Holmes stories.
Yeah, there's a lot to choose from there. And certainly listeners of this show will recognize Gothic elements as presented through things like the Sussex Vampire, certainly the Hound of the Baskervilles. I'm sure we could pick another half dozen or so or more of the Sherlock Holmes stories that have Gothic elements in them. But before we do that, and before we get into Conan Doyle's placement within that pantheon of Gothic artists, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you first came across Sherlock Holmes?
Well, I think before that wet caravan holiday, I was first introduced to Sherlock Holmes by seeing the Basil Rathbone movies. And I think I was about 10, and my brother and I used to stay with my grandparents at the weekend, and the BBC were repeating the old Rathbone movies. So my first clearest recollection of Sherlock Holmes is the chessboard sequence in Sherlock Holmes Faces Death. That well-known bit lifted directly from Musgrave Ritual, obviously. And also the claw in the Scarlet Claw, which had a very different recollection for me. So I was terrified of that. But so I saw those first. And then I think when I was about 12, we went on this typical British summer holiday caravan to Scotland, and it rained for 3 weeks. Unfortunately, I'd bought before then the Penguin Complete Sherlock Holmes. And in the space of about 3 weeks, I think I read the whole thing. And that was around the time that Granada started the Jeremy Brett series as well. So it all came together about the same time for me, really. But I was very much a solitary cyclist from then on for many years.
Now, so you had no friends who shared that interest, or no?
At school, there were a few people who were interested in Sherlock Holmes, but nobody, I think, ever to the same level of obsession, I think. They probably looked at me askance. But no, so I really found, I think, my foot in, I really found my Sherlockian experience kicking off when I met Paul Chapman and Teresa Dudley, which was about 7-8 years ago. And we were at a book fair in York. It's a fantastic one, takes place twice a year. And I was looking at some things on the shelf from one of the booksellers who said, "Oh, you're interested in Sherlock Holmes, and do you know Paul and Teresa?" Who happened to be there. We were introduced, and they said, "Oh, well, we've got this Science Society that meets every 5 to 6 weeks," and from then on, it's been meetings every couple of months.
Excellent.
That's
so,
great.
You're based in the north of England, then? I take it.
Yeah, so I'm based in York, which is roughly halfway between London and Edinburgh, and it's a beautiful old city, the old medieval capital, famous for our Vikings, and also famous for our flooding, which is so York is on the banks of the River Ouse, and it regularly floods. There's a famous flooding pub in the centre of York, but yeah, it's a lovely city, and so we have a group that meets, like I say, every 5-6 weeks. We meet in either Leeds or in York, which are only about half an hour apart. And we've got about 30 people, I think. 20 people would attend a typical meeting. But some of the members are people like David Stewart Davis and Catherine White are members. Matthew Booth's crime writer. John Hall, who wrote a lot of wrote some early Sherlockian chronology and several articles. And so there's a whole range of people. There's a big, long list of people who all do interesting things and come at the canon a different way. And we do the usual thing of toasts and quizzes and papers.
Excellent. Well, I mean, York, very picturesque area of England, and it makes sense that that's why the summer holiday would be in Scotland, not that far away, equally as picturesque, maybe a little cooler that time of the year. But York is probably famous to many folks as home of Highclere Castle, if I'm not mistaken, which is where they filmed certainly the external shots, well, some of the interior as well, for Downton Abbey.
It's not that far. We've also got, from here, we've got the building that was the exterior of Pondicherry Lodge in the Brett series. And if you go about an hour and a half away westward towards where I grew up in Liverpool, you hit Lyme Park, which is famous for being the Pride and Prejudice, Pemberley, in the BBC Collinworth Pride and Prejudice. So we're not short of a few nice day trips when we're allowed out of the house.
Yeah. Have you ever taken any Sherlockian or Doylean expeditions to some of these picturesque locations and had kind of a thematic type of a meeting?
Well, actually, we're just planning one to go across to Stonyhurst, which is out. It's about an hour and a half away from us now. And a group of people did go across from our group a while ago to do that and to do the Pondicherry Lodge visit as well. Although that was before my time, so we tend to meet in our regular pub in York, which we discovered last time we were there. Having met there several times, we discovered for the first time that it was the birthplace of Aloysius Hansom, the inventor of the hansom cab. So there is at least a little Sherlockian connection with the pub as well.
Do they provide valet service?
No, I'm just curious. Does the pub have a handsome name? Is it the Four-Wheeler? Or?
It doesn't, unfortunately. It's named after a tribe of Picts that were brutally suppressed by the Romans. So it's not exactly the most the most enticing name.
Nothing communicates fellowship and warm feeling and the joy of having a pint than to find something that was suppressed by the Romans.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Doings of Doyle. This is a podcast that you and Paul put together beginning last year in mid to late 2019. And from the site, it says, why produce a podcast dedicated to the work of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle? That's the question any sound-minded individual must think when chancing upon Doings of Doyle. And, one could argue whether I'm sound-minded or not, but I am wondering that nevertheless. Why start a podcast about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle?
I would like there to be a better explanation than this, but I think we were just desperate to talk about him. It came out of our shared enthusiasm and the fact that I don't think there are many outlets to really talk about Conan Doyle's wider work. So we both came to Conan Doyle through Sherlock Holmes. We're both avid Sherlockians in our own way, but there wasn't much of a space to share our enthusiasm for Conan Doyle's wider work and to connect to other people. And so we thought the podcast would be a nice way of doing that, with the emphasis really on the wider work. So it's not exclusively going to be about his non-Sherlockian work. We have touched recently on The Lost Special and The Man with the Watches, which is often classed as the apocrypha of Sherlock Holmes. But we try to go around that subject and then make connections back to the Sherlock Holmes canon. And so it really came out of our shared enthusiasm for Conan Doyle's work and a wish to share that with other people.
When you and Paul were discussing this, I mean, you've obviously known each other for the better part of a decade. You've had these adventures together with the Sherlockian groups, with the Jamesian groups. Talk us through a little bit. What if we were a fly on the wall during the planning session for Doings of Doyle? What would we have heard?
Well, I think what you would have heard, first of all, was Paul and I arguing about which was our favourite story and which one should go first. That was probably the first thing that happened. But fortunately, there's plenty to choose from. So I think when we started out, what we wanted to do was reflect both Conan Doyle's writing career, but also his career as a public figure. So it's not exclusively about his writings. We do tend to focus on his writings, but from the writings we'll segue into something else about his personality and character. And that's because I think both of us are fascinated by Conan Doyle as an individual. And, certainly for my part, though I've read about Conan Doyle for the best part of 3-4 decades, I still don't feel like I really know Conan Doyle. There's always something turns up that makes me think slightly differently about him or makes me approach the subject in a different way. And so we started from that perspective, and then we decided that the podcast should really try to do 3 things. The first is we should take a central writing and then talk about the themes within it and explore what we enjoy about that work or don't enjoy about that work. The second thing was then to look at the influences on Conan Doyle. So we're both very interested in the literary influences, but also the context. What's he drawing on, and how does that inform the story that he wants to tell? Does he have a deeper purpose behind the story? And what are the other literary influences, other authors that he's going to draw on there? And then the third thing, and this again goes back to our roots being Sherlockians first and then Conan Doyle aficionados after that, was to make some parallels and draw some connections between the work that we're looking at and the Sherlock Holmes stories themselves. And there are a surprisingly large number of those connections you can usually find in one of Conan Doyle's non-Sherlockian works, something that connects back to an aspect of the Sherlock Holmes canon.
Yeah. Well, you've packed an awful lot into that explanation there, and I think we want to unpack it bit by bit here because I think that it's worth exploring together. First, before you mention those 3 things, you mentioned Conan Doyle as a writer and Conan Doyle as a public figure, and certainly folks around these parts are well aware of Conan Doyle's writing expertise, capability, and, well, for the most part, his output. Although I don't think Sherlockians are as well versed in the breadth and depth of his output as Doyleans are. There's an awful lot of material there that isn't widely either widely available, nor is it widely understood or recognized unless you're actually searching for it. Nevertheless, what I'm curious about is, as you've studied Doyle, and I love how you said you still feel like you don't know the man, and that's almost it was almost by design. You know, he had some bit of mystery about him. I mean, he certainly put a patina over his life with memories and adventures, and Dennis and Adrian did their part to continue the Conan Doyle PR campaign, right?
Yeah.
But where did you see not necessarily the break, but the evolution of Conan Doyle, the public figure? That's the one that interests me. Is, of course, he was an author. Of course, he was known as an author. But when did he become? When did he start to become the Conan Doyle of the public? In as much as we understand, J.K. Rowling went from being an author now very much being a public figure.
Yeah, so I think you start to see that evolution very strongly in the 1890s. And as he's really got the platform that he's frankly been given by the success of the Sherlock Holmes stories, he finds his ability to get into other popular debates. And there's a really interesting letter he writes around the time he's a member of the Society of Authors, where he talks, I think he's talking about Hall Caine, who was another author he looked down on because of excessive marketing publicity gimmicks. He talks about the public duty of an author and the responsibility as a public figure. And so you see him start to wade in on a whole range of different issues. And I think that gets cemented around 1902 when he is part of the Boer War. And of course, he is knighted for the piece of work that he does around that. But you then see it evolve. You know, he starts to get involved in lots of different areas of work, famously things like the campaign for body armor, but also his legal campaigns on Dargy case and things like that. You know, there's a lot to him that we are still only scratching the surface, really, and so it's quite nice to take that viewpoint on his life as well, and to think about, you know, what else was going on at the time. I mean, if you take a classic case in point, if you think about the Sherlock Holmes stories and the number of references to unhappy marriages, and then Conan Doyle's campaign for divorce law reform, there are some clear parallels there. You see him use the Sherlock Holmes stories quite a few times to make a few political points. So in the diplomatic stories, you know, Bruce Partington Pan's The Second Saying and Naval Treaty, you get the sense he's somewhat chastising the British government for not being very prepared for a coming war, but also not being very good with secrets. And that was actually something he stated publicly as well. So you get this blurring of the line between his role as a public figure and his literary output as well, which just adds an extra layer of complexity. And as you said, you know, he very deliberately, I think, disguised his private life and his public image. And so you get echoes of that with things like Stark Munro letters and his deliberate suppression of very early works like The Firm of Girdleston, where you get the sense that he might think, you know, maybe I've gone a bit too far in giving something away from my own Gothic cupboard.
What do you think about that Gothic cupboard? You know, you mentioned just at the outset, you know, that you're a bit of a goth, and you got the M.R. James interest. So what do you think? You know, then there's so much to choose from. So what would you consider to be Conan Doyle's most Gothic story or stories? Well, particularly of interest to our, you know, viewers and listeners who, you know, might not have read any of this stuff. They might not know, you know, what's available, what he did.
Well, he's had a real resurgence in I think in the popular imagination as a Gothic writer. And I mentioned before Darryl Jones' book where he edits and collects a lot of the Gothic tales. And you can delve into almost any of those, but the one that I would single out as being really fascinating is The Case of Lady Sannox, which comes out in 1893. He writes it at about the same time as he's essentially throwing Sherlock Holmes over the Reichenbach Fall. And it's an incredibly shocking piece of writing. We did that for the 6th podcast, and I read it again for the first time in about 20 years, and I was genuinely shocked by that story. It's really visceral and horrible. So it's an absolute delight, and I recommend it heartily to every Sherlockian out there. It's also one that feels quite Sherlockian in nature. It actually, feels like it could be a Sherlock Holmes story in early draft.
Well, funny you should mention that, Mark. We actually have a clip from Doings of Doyle, specifically when you and Paul were talking about Lady Sannox. So let's go to the audio.
There are some echoes between Holmes and Stone.
Yeah, there are quite a lot when you look at this particular story. I mean, the very title, "The Case of Lady Sannox," sounds like it could be a detective story from the beginning. But also Stone's similarities to Sherlock Holmes, his brilliance and standing in his chosen occupation is similar to Holmes's as a detective. He has his wider potential. It's said of Stone, those who knew him best were aware that, famous as he was as a surgeon, he might have succeeded with even greater rapidity in any of a dozen lines of life. And we know from Holmes he could have been a forensic scientist or even a great actor.
Or a criminal.
Absolutely, yes. Stone physically operates in Holmes's home territory. Again, of Stone, his energy, his audacity, his full-blooded self-confidence. Does not the memory of them still linger to the south of Marylebone Road and the north of Oxford Street? This is where Baker Street is, of course. He even speaks like Holmes. When the Turkish gentleman calls on him, he says, "You will remember that I have an appointment, sir," said the surgeon with some irritation. "Pray confine yourself to the necessary details." It's all very, very Holmesian.
It is. And as much as Douglas Stone is a sensualist, and you wouldn't see that with Sherlock
that's
Holmes.
the one major difference between the two men.
Yeah, but you do still have the his whole bohemian soul.
Yes, and his indulgence in the 7% solution, etc.
Absolutely. So there are, while he's not one for the ladies, shall we say, in the same way as Douglas Stone, you still have an element of the bohemian indulgences about Sherlock Holmes as well.
That's wonderful. Now, Mark, in that kind of instance, do you think that it was a conscious blurring of the lines by Doyle, or was it something else? Was it a subconscious effort? Was it simply him, having these kinds of thoughts during a certain time period of his writing, and simply pouring them out into whatever story he had his hands on?
I think. I strongly suspect that Lady Sannox was something that started out as a possible Sherlock Holmes idea, and then he decided that actually the story he wanted to tell was not suitable for a Sherlock Holmes audience, and we see that hit that sort of self-editing on Conan Doyle's part several times. The cardboard box is the classic example of moving it around between collections because he doesn't think it's appropriate for the readership. So I think there's an element to which he might have been thinking along the lines of developing that story as a Sherlock Holmes story, and then swift left turn. But there are certain character traits that pop up in different characters. You start to see some parallels between characters in different stories, and he definitely borrows some ideas, and if not normally names, he borrows names an awful lot from different stories as well.
Who are some of your favorite characters out of the Conan Doyle omnibus, as it were, non-Sherlockian characters?
Well, I think probably one of my favourites is actually the captain of the Polestar. So the title character, because that's a classic ghost story. It is lauded as one of the great ghost stories, but that's a very sensitive depiction of a man who is completely on the edge. It starts with him being horrified by the prospect of being pursued by his lost love, and then you get the slow unraveling of his mind. And actually, you get that again with Douglas Stone in The Case of Lady Sannox, without wanting to give away exactly what happens in case people want to go off and read it. But I think Elaine Edrickson in The White Company is a fantastic character. I've always had a little bit more of a problem with Sir Nigel for the simple reason that he has a lisp, which I find very peculiar that that we get this reference to Sir Nigel having a lisp, and then that's stuck in my head every time I read The White Company or Sir Nigel. But there are so many characters, and often it's his incidental characters that are brilliant, where in The Winning Shot he has a character who is a major, a retired major, and in the space of about 7 or 8 words he establishes this very rounded character. And he only has about 3 or 4 lines of dialogue in the entire story. But Conan Doyle's so brilliant at being able to create a character from, just a handful of words, give you that sense almost immediately.
Those are great examples.
Absolutely. Isn't that the true mark of a talented writer? I mean, sure, anyone could inform you about a major character over pages and pages of chapters of information about their habits, their appearance, their lisp, you name it. But with the economy of words, and Conan Doyle was notorious for this throughout all of his writing, not just the Sherlock Holmes stories, but being able to, with a certain economy of words, being able to craft something that was so vivid in one's mind that you were able to walk away with such an impactful impression of a minor character who might not ever appear again, and yet it's indelibly marked on your brain.
Yeah, he's and he's very good at setting up characters before you see them as well. So a classic example of that is Milverton. Of course, so there's a lot of foreshadowing before anybody even appears. But I've always been drawn to his economy of style, as you say. And there's a great rejection letter he gets in the 1880s, and he writes to his mother and says, "I've been rejected again, basically because of my writing style. Does that editor not know that I cultivate those short, sharp sentences for a reason?" And paraphrasing, but that's essentially what he does. That's his style. That's what he wants to create. And I think that's why he can, even though the setting is obviously a different time and place, he still feels quite a contemporary author in many ways.
He does. For a moment there, Mark, I thought you were going to mention the time when the tax collector sent back a note after Doyle earned only £54 during that particular year. He sent in his tax return, and there came a note back with it that said insufficient, and he wrote a note back that said, "I quite agree."
Absolutely.
Well, let's take a quick break here and hear from our sponsors, and then we will come right back and talk with Mark more about Doings of Doyle.
The Wessex Press has been running around the clock to bring you a remarkable new book, The Annotated White Company, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's 1891 masterpiece, an historical adventure of the 15th century. 5 generations of kings from 2 rival dynasties fought for 100 years over the throne of the largest kingdom in Western Europe. It was the age of chivalry, a time of honor, courtesy, and patriotism, a story that's annotated now for the first time by Doug Elliott and Roy Pilot, who define unfamiliar terms, explain heraldic insignia, and describe the book's real-life characters, with a foreword by Nicholas Meyer and including the classic illustrations by N.C. Wyeth. Join the adventure by getting your copy of The White Company from wesexpress.com today.
All right, we're back. We're speaking with Mark Jones, who is one half of the Doings of Doyle podcast. It's a project that he and Paul Chapman have undertaken together, and that they record every so often. Mark, what's the cadence? How often do you put out a new episode on Doings of Doyle?
Well, we've been hit a bit by COVID-19, unfortunately, because one of the great things that that happened early on is that our local university gave us access to a recording studio, but unfortunately it's now in lockdown, so we can't get in. But we started, what we did was we started recording in October and released the first episode in November after we'd recorded the second episode. So the idea was to always have one episode in the bag, as it were. And then we commit to a monthly schedule. Okay. So so we tend to try and hit around about the second or third week of the month. And what we do is Paul and I will typically research the topic the month before, and we'll have a quick chat before we go into the recording studio, where we pick up the themes that we want to explore in that particular episode and divide them up between ourselves. So we each do our own sort of separate research and then come together with a few hours to spare, quickly work out what we're going to do. But it's great because Paul's interested in some things, I'm interested in others, and there's invariably we find something that we haven't considered before to talk about. So we've been planning now the next 3 podcasts, and we've been doing the research for those, ready for when we can actually get back onto campus and to make use of the recording studio.
This is a wonderful learning experience, for Scott and I to hear somebody talking about planning, podcasts, research. My eyes are open. My life will never be the same.
Yeah, I'm still waiting to show up with an idea.
So, I love the approach that you have. Do you ever surprise each other when you're, of course, what are some examples? I can imagine you would. What are some examples of that?
Yeah, so Paul's incredibly well read on his Victorian and Edwardian literature. I mean, he knows whole aspects of the literature of the time that I've never covered. So often he will come up with a reference to a writer, and I'll have to quickly go scrambling through my notes to find out what I've actually written about this person before. He's a great one for Edgar Allan Poe. And there's a lot of Poe influence on Conan Doyle, of course. So often Paul will spot those kind of connections. I tend to do much more of the sort of historical research around things. So I tend to dig into some of the writing history. And also I'm really lucky in that with my work, I'm in London typically a couple of times a week. Or at least I am when I'm not locked into the house. And that means I've been able to get to the British Library and get into the archives and consult original documents. So when we did Lady Sannox, one of the things that I was really pleased about was that we were able to find a very early adaptation of the case of Lady Sannox for the stage in a play called The Black Mask, which is a 3-part drama. And the second act is a complete lift of the case of Lady Sannox, supposedly with the author's permission, although I've not been able to find out how and why it came about, although I strongly suspect it was through, the writer was the brother of a member of the Society of Authors that Conan Doyle was familiar with. So things like that are quite nice, that you suddenly can turn up some original documentation that other people haven't necessarily seen before. So I like to keep a few of those in the pocket if I'm going into a podcast with Paul, because he'll almost certainly get me on some obscure bit of Edwardian literature. So I need to hold something back.
Now, what about influences on Conan Doyle? You mentioned that earlier. And, I remember that Lancelin Green, in the Oxford version of the canon, in the Oxford volumes of the canon and in the notes, discovered what for me were a whole bunch of contemporary influences and hooks into certain things that appeared in the Sherlock Holmes story. And I'm just curious, what other than other authors, and he was a great reader and lectured on English literature. But other than authors, I'm curious if you found any other things like influences in the research.
I think probably the thing that surprised me most was the influence of spiritualist writings right from the beginning of the 1880s. So, it's often the sort of the default answer is that Conan Doyle lost his son in the First World War and then became a spiritualist. And we know it predates that significantly. But when you can turn up stories written in 1881, 1882, when he's, 22, 23, 24, and they have tacit references to spiritualism, or they have references to mediums or other aspects of paranormal inquiry. That's quite fascinating, because I think you start to get a slightly different picture of Conan Doyle again. It's one of those instances where you think, maybe I didn't quite know this man. So the second episode we did was on a short story called The Winning Shot, which is not particularly great, it has to be said, but it's interesting because it's a vampire-y sort of tale, as he described it to his mother, and in it he has one of the characters going on a bit of a rant about certain spiritualists, just right there in the middle of that short story. But that short story also gives us some strange Sherlockian connections as well. So the first time that the vampire is called, well, he's not officially a vampire, but let's for argument's sake call him a vampire. It's called Dr. Octavius Gaster. And when he appears in Dartmoor for the first time, he is silhouetted against the moon on top of a tor. And then right towards the end of that short story, there's an exchange with several locals at a shooting match where one of them talks about Farmer Watson and his bullpup. And that's 1883. So, you get these little echoes where you think, Conan Doyle's definitely borrowing from his back catalogue at certain times, whether it's consciously or unconsciously. So you get this nice bits of things where you get the influence coming in from things like the spiritualism quite early, and then you get the echo of what he's written appearing in the Sherlock Holmes stories later.
That's marvelous. I had never I'd never realized that timeline before, Mark. That's really, it gives me something to think about. So the more you've talked about it, and the more I've heard that spiritualism runs deep in the Conan Doyle veins, there seems to me to be this incredible overlap between romantic Gothicism and spiritualism itself. I mean, certainly, the mentions of vampirism and whatnot, but how much of the world of ghosts and other spiritual matters, and I'm not talking about spiritualism necessarily, but the world of the spirits flows over into spiritualism versus kind of a Gothic a theme, and is there a stark line there, or is it really something that's blurry?
I think it's really very, very blurry and starts very early. And yes, he's interested in ghost stories. He's interested in people like Bulwer Lytton and what they're writing, and he echoes a lot of the early ghost stories in some of those 1880s short stories. But there is no hard and fast line, I don't think. I think he is fascinated by it all the way through his life. The really interesting thing, and I've never been able to quite work out where it happens, but at some point there's the point where the scientific rationalist turns into the believer. And it may be that it's this 1916-17 Kingsley incident, but I suspect it's earlier. And it's where he moves his mindset from I'm going to take a scientific approach to this phenomenon that I don't understand to actually I want to believe that this is evidence of the afterlife. And I don't think those things are quite, I think we could sense that they are probably a slow evolution, but I suspect somewhere along the line there was a switch flicked, and I've never quite found that. So I think the spiritualist one is an interesting one, but behind that, I think it's built on a lifelong fascination with ghosts, and that probably predates even Conan Doyle arriving. That goes into his father and his grandfather and fairies and things like that go right into the heart of the story of the Doyles. And there was an academic was talking at a conference I went to last year, where he suggested that one of the great areas of research that should be done is the Doylaspora, is the spreading of the Doyles from Ireland and what they brought with them, because actually they bring a lot of myths and legends that then translate into Conan Doyle's stories, and before him into his father's illustrations and his grandfather's illustrations.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is there any evidence, either in his own writings or writings about him, that he had any encounters with otherworldly figures?
He does mention a couple of times that sensing another presence. And I do wonder about, there are moments in the diary of his expedition on the Hope where you do wonder if he's actually alluding to something else that happened, just sort of reading between the lines. I don't think there's anything categorically there stated, at least I'm not aware of it. But he definitely plays with the ideas. And he's quite playful with the ideas of ghosts as well. I mean, it's not that he's always writing horrific ghost stories. I mean, there's a very silly short story called Selecting a Ghost about a man who buys a haunted house and is very disappointed to discover that there isn't a resident ghost, so he goes interviewing for one. So, you get he's playful with it as well. It's not going to be all about dread and fear.
But I've always had the sense that Conan Doyle was not someone who invested any time at all in wondering or thinking about or exploring whether or not ghosts were real. I think that, it just seems to me that so particularly for somebody born in the 1859, he grew up with death. In fact, I think he was one of 10 children, and I think 2 young children didn't survive childhood. I mean, death was a fact of life for him. And then, you pick that up in his other readings. I don't know if you've ever read that sort of odd novel that he wrote called Duet, the manuscript of which I think he gave to his second wife, which is a story all about Frank and Maud. It's this couple that are starting out, and there's a scene in there where I think they're in the Abbey, and he's just written a lot about being in the Hall of the Great Dead. I mean, it seems to me that he was someone who the dead were very much alive to him.
Well, I think he's got for all he rejected Catholicism, he's got quite a Catholic view of death. And there's a sort of level of comfort with it that, even today you talk to people from Ireland and their attitude to death is quite different to people from England. And it's hugely culturally determined and goes back centuries. But I think he has that sort of sensibility as well. And as much as he turned his back on Roman Catholicism, you can still see the influences in a lot of his writing. I don't think somebody who wasn't brought up a Catholic could have written The White Company, for example, with all its medieval illusion.
Now, Mark, you mentioned before, with regard to spiritualism, there being likely being a triggering event, and it seems to me like in Doyle's outsized influence as an author, in his growing reputation as a public figure, there were certain instances, whether it was a piece of legislation or a needed piece of legislation, whether it was a legal case like Oscar Slater, whether it was the death of his son Kingsley in World War I or following World War I, that triggered a certain outburst of him, that it either triggered writings about it or public speaking about it or some force of nature that caused Conan Doyle to really take up a cause. Is that a theme that you see happening over and over again with him? And if there were no triggering event, would Conan Doyle still have gone to bat for these types of arguments?
That's a really good question. I think you definitely see in his work, both as a public campaigner and in his writing, a sense of injustice. There's a profound sense of injustice in his work, even if you get relatively silly Gothic tales where somebody gets their comeuppance. That's a tale of injustice as well. The New Catacomb and somebody being led down the path and left there is a revenge story as well. So I think that is something that's just part of his makeup. And the other part of his makeup is the chivalric ideal, is the romantic ideal. And that those two things, I think, carry through almost all of his writing. So I think when he spotted injustice, he was quite keen to jump on it. we covered an element of this in one of the podcasts on a really peculiar story, Danger, being the log of John Sirius, which is essentially Conan Doyle having a rant about the British Navy not being ready for submarines in the First World War. But he actually, that was actually his third attempt at getting his message across. He'd had a previous attempt where he talked directly to politicians to warn them. He wrote a fantastic short story, The Last Galley, I think it's 1911, which is one of my favourites. It's absolutely brilliant, but it's far too subtle to get its message across. So he goes with this absolute blunt instrument, which is the story of how an insignificant Northern European naval power uses 8 submarines to bring the British Empire to its knees. And he just uses that literary device to basically make his point. So he had a lot of tools in his arsenal to be able to make those political points, as well as lobbying people directly. So I think that sense of injustice or standing up on the basis of chivalric notions, I think that's something that carries through absolutely everything and ends up on his gravestone ultimately.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, there was this golden thread seemingly running throughout Conan Doyle's life, and he was steel true and blade straight, and you couldn't make him sort. Even if, because here's the thing, even if he didn't truly believe in what he was writing, like for example, a famous line in The Sussex Vampire is, "This agency stands flat-footed upon the ground," and yet it's at the same time that Conan Doyle is throwing himself wholeheartedly into spiritualism and believed that to the point of destroying his relationship with Harry Houdini, that he believed so fervently in this. And when he had a thought, when he had a cause, you couldn't shake him from it, could you?
No, and the example of Sussex Vampire is a really good one, because it shows, I think, for all Conan Doyle wanted to be remembered for the White Company, it shows his sincerity in his treatment of Sherlock Holmes. There's no way Sherlock Holmes was ever going to be turned around to be a spiritualist. He couldn't do that. It was so alien to the character, it just wouldn't work. Professor Challenger, on the other hand, and again, he takes a slightly different approach there. That's scientific proof being brought to bear on something. So I think he has a sense of fidelity in his characters as well. That means that he wouldn't, as much as that would have been the easiest thing for him to have done to promote spiritualism, would be to drop it into a Sherlock Holmes tale. I think he has too much respect for the characters and for what they stand for to go that extra mile.
Good summary. I agree. I mean, Sherlock Holmes is a skeptic. He's very much rooted in things you can see and touch and feel and draw conclusions from. We
have been avoiding doing the Professor Challenger stuff up till now, not for any great dislike of it. We actually both really enjoy the Professor Challenger stories, but the one that was going to be first on our list was going to be The Poison Belt, which unfortunately is about an illness that sweeps the globe with terrible consequences, and we thought that's probably not the best one to do during a pandemic.
No. And anyway, if the World Health Organization had existed, Challenger would have blamed it anyways.
So
good for
what is next? What future episodes do we have to look forward to in the coming months?
Well, we've been prepping, I think, 3 or 4. The next one is going to be on Captain Sharky, which is pretty obscure even for people interested in Conan Doyle, I think. So that's his pirate tales. He wrote 4 short stories about Captain Sharky. And they're really interesting because they are not typical pirate tales, I would say. Sharky is a particularly hideous character, and that ties into Conan Doyle's idea of the hero and chivalric ideals, So there's some interesting stuff on that. We've then got, I think, after that, we're going to look at Straggler of 15 in the play Waterloo. A lot's been written on that, but I think we'll find something. we'll find something out of that. There's lots of stuff there. The Terror of Blue John Gap is going to be coming up soon, which is a terrific short story. And I was in Derbyshire for a holiday a couple of years ago and reread it while going around the mines. And it's very evocative. It's a great short story. And then after that, we're going to go, I think, for The Refugees, which is a very little known or little remembered historical novel. Full title is The Refugees, A Tale of Two Continents, which starts in the court of Louis XIV and ends up in French Canada. And that's a really interesting story. Lots of boy's own adventure in there, despite Conan Doyle wanting, I think, to start out as a sort of serious historical novel. By the time he gets to the second half, he has to have lots of cowboy and Indian type sequences going on. So we've got those coming up. And then I think our plan as well is to try and do some interview episodes if we possibly can, because there's so much stuff happening in the world of Conan Doyle now. There's a sense of a bit of a resurgence, and I hope it continues. So not only have we got, the Gothic resurgence of Conan Doyle, there's the Edinburgh edition is going to be coming out soon. I think the first volume of that is planned for this year, and that's going to be a 22-volume work coming out of Edinburgh Napier University with full introductions and scholarly argument. And then you've obviously got, you've spoken to Ashley Polasek before, of course, about the Conan Doyle Review, which is great because that's going to be bringing in all of the academic work, which has really spiraled in the last 10, 15 years as well. So I think there's a lot of stuff happening there. Actually, the other thing I must mention, because I think you covered it in the podcast as well, was, of course, the Annotated White Company. From good Sherlockian stock, we're getting some excellent pieces of work, and that is a really astonishing piece of work. It's a terrific volume, and much value, great value to people interested in Doyle more broadly. So I'm hoping that we can do some interview shows as well and bring those into the schedule.
Sounds like we have a long time to wait before you get to when the Brigadier slew the fox.
Well, we wanted to do some Gerard quite early on, but the problem was that when we sat down at the pub to go and talk about Gerard, we realised we would just be repeating the jokes at each other. And to be honest, with the best will in the world, it's much better for you to read Conan Doyle's version of the jokes than us laughing in between a pint of beer about what happens. But there are three stories that all have a brilliant English character called the Bart, the Baronet, or who Gerard refers to as the Bart, and they make a nice sort of collection of three stories. So I think they will probably be the first venture into Gerard.
Oh, that's great.
Well, it sounds like we have a lot to look forward to from Mark Jones and Paul Chapman of the Doings of Doyle podcast. Mark, we do appreciate you taking the time to be with us today and to explain to us a little bit about not only the show and its origins, but certainly of the life of Conan Doyle. I think we've barely scratched the surface there, and I would encourage our listeners, if you enjoyed this interview with Mark, if you enjoy the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, subscribe to Doings of Doyle at doingsofdoyle.com. Mark, thanks for being here with us on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
And thanks very much, Scott and Bert. It's great to be here, and thanks a lot for all your work on the podcast. It's always great to listen to.
Well, it was just wonderful. It's wonderful to talk to Mark, and wonderful to spend time in Conan Doyle. And what you said at the end of the conversation with Mark was that if you have an interest in Conan Doyle and you'd like to know more, you should subscribe to the podcast, which you certainly should do. But even if you don't have an interest in Conan Doyle, you should subscribe to the podcast so that your eyes can be opened and you can see what you're missing. I mean, Conan Doyle, just from a literary side, as someone who wrote plays, and in the whole conversation, we touched the gamut of it. A little bit of his life, the outline, his campaigns for revolution in the army, his work, as Mark said, on behalf of justice, his knightly sense, but also his plays, his spiritualism. He collaborated with James Barrie, the author of Peter Pan, on a play that was not very successful. But it's just poetry, a fascinating fellow with amazing work.
Right. He had poetry, He had political works. I mean, plenty of stuff there. You know, one of my favorite short stories of Conan Doyle, and I'm glad Mark mentioned Blue John Gap. That was it's always a spooky one. I've got an audio version of that somewhere. I think it's on cassette, but I should think about converting that. But my other one, on the flip side of that cassette, is The Horror of the Heights. Have you ever read that one?
Yeah, years ago. Is that in Round the Red Lamp, or is that some other collection?
I think it is. Again, one of these borders on ghost story / science fiction. And it works well because it merges with present day or then present day technology and the unknown regions of the upper atmosphere. Fun stuff.
Fascinating.
Fun stuff.
Very fun stuff.
Well, speaking of fun stuff, this is time for everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz show. That's right. It's Canonical Couplets. It's the show you've come to know and love, where we give you 2 lines of poetry, and you are expected to identify one Sherlock Holmes story from it. Now, if you were with us last time, you may recall this Canonical Couplet clue. On this occasion, Holmes put in his oar. At a young man's insistence, pour le sport. Bert, do you know the answer to this canonical couplet?
Of course I do. That was the story about labor unrest in a Pennsylvania chewing gum factory. That was the Valley of Fleer.
Fleer not, good friends. It was not. No, it was, that's an inspired guess though. But it's just about as stale as the chewing gum that would come with the baseball cards and smash into 100 pieces when it hit the sidewalk. No, what we were looking for was, the Adventure of the Missing 3/4.
Oh, of course.
Yes, put in his oar, pour le sport. This was, of course, the 2 rugby teams that had their match, and there was one player who was missing, the missing 3/4. Well, it looks like we stumped quite a few of you. There were only a handful of submissions last time. I don't know if it was because we truly stumped people or because if listenership is down because of the pandemic. Which I should note, we saw a dip in listenership after the first month. We saw a dip in April, but May we've seen the numbers come back up again, so that's encouraging. But nevertheless, we will haul out the old canonical spinning wheel and we will give it a big spin to figure out who's going to win the prize. We'll watch it slow down and land on number 2. Wow, early on. And that corresponds to Bill Treacy. Bill, congratulations. Got a repeat winner here. That's a good thing. We will send you a copy, Bert, of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, Barnes & Noble. No. Yes. Wait. Did we promise a certain gift last time around? No, we promised, that's what we promised, not the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. We promised a gift card to Regina Stinson's Sherlockian Etsy store. That's right. Very good. So we'll have that for you. And now, this time around, we will offer that Barnes & Noble Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, the leatherette edition from the 1970s. That is our enticement to get you to answer this canonical couplet. A wild goose chase is sometimes all you need to accommodate the object of a felon's greed. If you know the answer to this week's canonical couplet, jot it down in an email marked canonical couplet sent to comment@ihearofsherlock.com. If you are among the correct answers and we choose you randomly, you'll win that fabulous prize. Good luck. Now, I should note, anytime goose comes up, with regard to Sherlock Holmes, your mind is going to automatically go to a certain story around Christmas time. This is not that story. All right. There is another wild goose chase that refers to. So think through it and think about what those two lines said. And you'll come up with, again, we have done a canonical couplet for almost every single Sherlock Holmes story. Right? There are only 4 left that we have not done yet. So if you are an avid listener of the show, and if, unlike Bert, you've actually been keeping track of the stories that we've been quoting here or giving you clues to, you'll be able to narrow it down. So good luck with that. Well, Bert, I suppose this is the part where we tease our next episode.
Oh boy.
You ready for a teaser?
Yes, please.
A Malteser?
I'll have one of those Malteser Falcons too, please.
That's going to set you back a couple of chocolates.
No, that's all right.
No doubt.
Captain Jack, the skipper of the La Paloma, brought it wrapped up in newspaper.
Well, next episode we are we are interviewing 2 co-authors of a book from the BSI Press. So you'll have to stay tuned for that to see exactly who the authors/editors are and what the book is. But I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
In the meantime, I is Scott Monty.
And I was Bert Wolder.
And together we say the games of foot.
The games of foot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.